Hello. Great. Hi, I'm Hannah. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Director of Christians on the Left, and it is my joy to welcome you to tonight's Tawney Dialogue. In time-honoured fashion and tradition, we will start with a few housekeeping notices. There are no fire alarms planned that I'm aware of, and if there is one, the fire escape is down there and to the main entrance. Hopefully that will not come into practice. If you are watching online, hello to you as well. We're streaming this live on YouTube, and you will know if you're watching online, if you have questions when we get to that point, you can email them in, and we will be kind of hearing from you as well. The Tawney Dialogue is an annual event. It brings together policy and theology in the long tradition of Christian socialism, of which we are part, as the Christian socialist movement in our former incarnation. And we owe a lot to R.H. Tawney, and I was really pleased to see he gets a fair few mentions in Lisa's excellent book, more of which later, I'm sure, which leads me on to introduce our speakers for tonight. We have Lisa Nandy, who's the Labour MP for Wigan, has served as Shadow Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities since 2021, was previously Shadow Foreign Secretary, and also worked for the Children's Society, I was just hearing, so kind of used to crowds of people like us here tonight. And also the author of All In, How to Build a Country That Works, which is a fantastic book. I can recommend it, and I'm sure she'll be sharing with us more about it and kind of the vision behind it. And then we're also delighted to have Jim Walters with us tonight, who is the Professor in Practice in the Department of International Relations, LSE. Also runs the LSE Faith Centre and is the chaplain of LSE, and has published several books, including Loving Your Neighbour in an Age of Religious Conflict. He's a priest in the Church of England and Canon of Chichester, honorary Canon of Chichester Cathedral, and a former exec member. So again, kind of we're delighted to have you back with us tonight. If you've not been to Tawney before, how it will work is we'll hear from Lisa first, Jim will then give us a response to that, and then we'll have a time for Q&A. And I should say at this point that Lisa we're delighted to have you with us, but Lisa is leaving at 7 p.m. Hopefully at which point our wonderful chair, Johnny Reynolds, will magically appear and seamlessly fill this chair for the rest of the Q&A coming off the subs bench. So hopefully that will all kind of work, but we'll get to that when we come to it. So without any further ado, and mindful that we do need to kind of give you some time to speak, as you're going to be leaving us at 7, I'll hand over to Lisa to kick us off.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. I love the idea of Johnny Reynolds on the subs bench. Hopefully I'll get the chance to tell him. As you've just heard, I did write a book, which we published at the end of last year, about how we build a country that works. At a time when things feel so fundamentally broken, I was really struck by the fact that everywhere that I went in the country, hope burned brighter than ever before. And it gave me a sense that really, in the end, people believe in this country, they believe in what we can do, and they're open to real, fundamental, transformational change. That this is a moment that we've got to seize with both hands in order to build the sort of country that we've believed in all of our lives, but never yet quite seen. But today, I wanted to use this moment to think through what lies behind that, what the guiding principle of our politics should be. What I want to talk to you about today is what we owe to one another. After a decade in which we've found multiple ways to divide and hurt one another and ourselves, what are the obligations we have to each other, and where are the ties that bind? And this is, I think, a question that preoccupied Tawney's generation as they emerged from the Edwardian era, as the situation of women began slowly to be questioned and the working classes organised to improve their condition. Tawney, alongside William Beveridge, Annie Besant and other leading figures of the time, made his home at Toynbee Hall, a place very familiar to me from the work that I did with the Children's Society, campaigning to get refugee children out of immigration detention centres a whole century later. And they made their home at Toynbee Hall amidst the slums of East London, where the lives of working class men, women and children were too short and too hard. And as Britain entered the war, Tawney enlisted as a regular soldier amongst the working class men who were fighting and dying in large numbers for their country, their generation immersed themselves in the world in which most people lived because they saw clearly that the gulf that existed between the elites and the rest threatened the very fabric of our society and our political system. Tawney's often criticised for being slower than others of his generation to see the flames that were licking at the sides of liberal democracy. But when we look back in history at our own time, when faith in politics as a lever for change is so depressingly absent in so many parts of the country, perhaps the question we'll face is why so few of us saw it at all. This is not a surprise to me that people have lost trust, lost faith in government. This is a government, after all, that has very little sense of obligation. In the last fortnight, ministers have decided to serve notice of eviction on thousands of Afghan refugees, many of whom served alongside our armed forces for 2 decades and ran into danger 2 summers ago to help bring others to safety. They've criticised frontline workers for their wage demands and characterised refugees as a drain on our resources. Just yesterday, I was in the House of Commons chamber to hear a minister announce plans to house asylum seekers on barges, telling us that accommodation for migrants should meet their essential living needs and nothing more. And yet at the same time, leading politicians have been touting their services for £10,000 a day and have escaped censure, while the Chancellor has chosen, at a time when millions are struggling to heat their homes and put food on the table, to prioritise a £1 billion tax cut for the wealthiest 1%. It's no wonder then that people have lost trust and faith in their government. But I think the problem runs deeper than that, because people haven't just lost faith in their politicians and their government, but in politics and government itself. And perhaps it's not that hard to see why. Since the global financial crash in 2008, it's been clear that the model that we have no longer commands popular support. The vote to leave the EU in towns like mine in Wigan was people calling time on an economy that we work harder for than ever before, but doesn't work for most of us, that has no respect for the contribution that we have to make to our national effort and writes most of us off, and in doing so writes us out of our national story because of who we are, the backgrounds we come from, and where we happen to live. There is, I think, no longer any support for the notion that we're all self-interested, atomised individuals. There is growing anger in our towns and cities about the rent seekers who come in and take and extract for short-term gain. A belief, a widespread belief, I think, in every region and nation, that when it comes to our town centres and our football clubs and the social institutions that, as the Tory MP Jessie Norman says, helps to shape and define us as we shape and define them, that not everything should be and can be up for sale. There is, I think, no longer an acceptance either that we can outsource questions of justice to the market to decide. Take the millions of people in this country who live in cold, damp, mouldy, unaffordable homes in Britain. And why has this been allowed to happen? Because we've come to see housing as simply a market and not a fundamental human right. Policies like the right to buy deliberately bake this in, seeking to align the interests of individuals with a financial class who could use housing as leverage. And in 2008, when it all came crashing down, well, we saw the consequences. The system has collapsed, but it's collapsed, I think, under the weight of its own contradictions, not for any compelling alternative. In fact, in the decade since the financial crash, very little has emerged to take its place. And reflecting on Tawney's life, Alistair McIntyre wrote, "It's clear what is missing. The moral denunciation of British capitalism took its content and its interest not from the morality of socialists, but from the immorality and evil of capitalism." But what then emerged, what later emerged, was the welfare state as we know it. From that confluence of individuals who came together at Toynbee Hall in the slums of the East End, out of that emerged a morality of socialism that led to the welfare state as we know it. Beveridge's 5 evils, the basis of an ethical socialism, and the Attlee government that followed. And this, I think, is the task for us all, to consider what it means to be an ethical socialist today, to replace the mantra that we hear from this government about what works and delivery and getting things done, a technocratic managerial approach to politics, with an ethical approach that allows us to navigate these complex and stormy times. What is the ethical basis of modern politics? What are our obligations to one another beyond the transactional cash nexus of consumer capitalist relations? And how do we make just and fair decisions when competing interests and rights are at stake? Well, I would suggest firstly that we should assert a respect for the contribution that people have to make to the common good. No person should be written off because of the background they come from or the community they live in. Beveridge said that idleness was one of the 5 evils that plagued society in the time that he and Tawney lived. And in one sense, I think that is what the slogan Levelling Up spoke to. Not the sort of George Osborne rhetoric about the shirkers and the workers, the strivers and the doers, but this right to make a contribution through work that has pride and purpose. That is what has been lost in towns like mine, that within living memory powered this country and powered the world and could do again. It's an economic necessity now to rebuild our local economies in every region and nation, but it's a moral necessity too. And this recognition that people have a contribution to make does, I think, lead to a whole series of conclusions. That, for example, our media, our arts and our culture must be made and shaped by us all, because the story that a nation tells to itself, about itself, must reflect all of us and not just some. And secondly, I think that the individual exists in society, and that's something that we have come to forget, and in turn society is what gives our lives meaning. We're not just the self-interested, atomised individuals that we were told we were throughout the 80s and 90s. The financial crash should have been the moment that we paused to reevaluate our approach to this, to entail a respect, as Charles Taylor puts it, for the right of everyone to their own unique way of being human. Perhaps this is the way of leaving behind the culture wars that have plagued the right of British politics and the identity wars that have plagued the left, and navigate our way through choices, whether it's the debate about the rights of women and transgender women, a debate that has far too much heat, far too little light, far too little care and compassion, or the binary and false choice about whether you can believe we have obligations to people beyond our borders and within them. And thirdly, I think that we need to reconsider the moral limits to markets. These are not just abstract questions. In my town, in Wigan, in Knowsley, and in other parts of the country, refugees are currently being housed in hotels, often substandard, unsafe accommodation, where they're harassed by far-right activists who gather to try to hound them out of our communities. Why? Because a company whose sole driver is profit has been put in charge of vulnerable human lives and has unsurprisingly then sourced accommodation in cheaper places where that profit can be maximised. But so often, as in my experience in Wigan, without care for those vulnerable people or the communities who seek to welcome them. And when millions live in housing that is unfit for human habitation, surely we've got to recognise that we cannot just leave it to the market to decide. If the death of a 2-year-old boy in Rochdale from prolonged exposure to mould and damp doesn't teach us this lesson, when will it? Now, this is not an exhaustive account of what an ethical socialism for the 21st century might look at, but it is a debate I think that we must have. 3 years ago, we lost the trust of people across Britain in places where Labour ran through people's family history like their DNA, where once we were them and they were us, and it was a long time in the making. These are the places where there is real anger about the lack of respect for the contribution that people have to make, where a one-word plan for most of us, redistribution, just simply will not do. That there are things that matter to us, our high streets, our football clubs, our social clubs and community institutions, the buses that connect us to friends and family and work and opportunity. There are things that matter deeply and are not up for sale. And I've come to see that there has to be, to rebuild the trust of those people, there has to be what Tawney called the common foundation, to think anew about our relationship with the people, to restore faith in labour, based not on a transaction or a contract, but on the golden rule of reciprocity that was at the heart of Tawney's socialism, and based on a more democratic politics that helps us to navigate difference and complexity and negotiate our way through shared challenges in the interests of the many. This was in many ways the challenge that confronted Tawney's generation in very different times, and it's the challenge that confronts ours today. It's a serious challenge, but I think it is the only way out of our current crisis, to build a new relationship with the British people based on reciprocity, contribution and the common good, an ethical socialism that can help us to reach a shared understanding of what it is that we owe to one another. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Lisa. There's, I'm sure, plenty of thoughts in that we want to ask you lots of questions about, but first we'll have a response to that. I don't know how you how you match that, but you can give it a try, Jim.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Hannah and Christians on the Left for inviting me to take part in this dialogue, and I'd like to pay tribute to Christians on the Left for holding this event in memory of R.H. Tawney, who was a professor of economic history at the London School of Economics for over 2 decades. We ought to have named something after him, but you keep his memory alive for us. And I too was pleased to see that Lisa quoted him in her book. So second, thank you to Lisa for your words this evening and for the book. Thank you because it's good, and I agree with much of it. But thank you also because we need to discuss these ideas that can genuinely take politics in a new direction after this extremely dispiriting period in our national life. Tawney, as you say, was also writing through times of global conflict and economic depression, and without his intellectual efforts, and, as you said, those of his friend and colleague William Beveridge, the 1945 government would not have been able to transform our country in the way that it did. So let's gain power, but let's have some substantial ideas to enact when we get there. And Lisa's book is about a vision of democracy that goes all the way down. It's a critique of centralizing forces, both those of government and corporate power, that take agency away from the local level. And that seems to characterize our times. I see it in the church, where people feel power has moved from the parish level to decision makers at the center. I see it in my university, where people feel that important decisions are being taken by leadership without consultation. And Lisa makes a very compelling case that for all the talk of levelling up, power is not coming down to the communities and towns across the country. So I'm very drawn to this kind of reinvigoration of democratic participation as a foundation for the ethical socialism that was described. I've just got 3 points I'd like to raise. The first is that at many points in the book, and perhaps this evening, I thought you were going to talk about religion, but you didn't. We need to talk about it because it is very present in a lot of the problems that you diagnose in the book, forms of nationalism and inter-community conflict that are a major threat to national and global stability. But more positively, faith communities seem to exemplify much of the civil society empowerment that you're calling for. They have the unusual combination of volunteers and the vision to inspire them, the social capital and the spiritual capital, which is why so many community projects, including over 1,000 food banks, are run by faith groups, of whom the majority inevitably in this country are Christian. And I know that you know this from your work at the Children's Society and so forth. But I think this is a point that will matter to many in the audience tonight, because we still encounter secular prejudices on the left. More often than not, it's a simple lack of literacy about who believers are and what they do. We don't want to be ignored, but neither do we want to be instrumentalized or sentimentalized. Faith groups are complex, and engaging with some of them may mean diplomatic compromises. And I was talking just recently to some members of Jesus House, a church very different to my own, who are still angry about Keir Starmer's visit to that church to see what they were doing in the vaccine rollout with the London black community. But he then, of course, apologized for visiting because of that church's stance on LGBTQ issues. Social conservatism is widespread in faith groups, particularly the smaller ones. So we have to acknowledge that not all diversity characteristics intersect comfortably, and we have to develop a sophisticated approach to that. So that's my first question. Does Labour currently have an informed, constructive approach to religion? Second, I share the optimism that you voiced tonight and set out in the book about what ordinary people can achieve when they are given resource and authority to get on with the job. But equally, I don't want to be naive about that. I see parallels in the interfaith work that we convene at the centre I lead at LSE. Some want to imagine that you just bring students of different faiths from all around the world to a central London campus, and they're all going to get on respectfully and learn from one another in this glorious, loving way, like a sort of Star Trek Federation. Well, they might, or they might become tribal and fearful of one another. They might argue about conflicts that are going on in other parts of the world. They might be prejudiced and hostile to one another's difference. A Christian would say that sin gets in the way. So the programs we run are seeking to create the conditions for good interfaith encounter. How do we build trust and mutual understanding? How do we create relationships strong enough to survive entrenched disagreement? And how do we acknowledge and address power imbalances in these spaces? And I'd perhaps like to tease out a little bit some of the conditions that enable for the kind of flourishing community engagement that we want to see. What are the key drivers of this renewal at a time when a lot of institutions of civil society, unions, working men's clubs, church groups, have been weakened? Those institutions often played an important role in fostering leadership. So who is forming leaders now? And how then do we support those leaders while preventing individuals or groups from dominating? And I think I'd also want to say, perhaps a little bit in contrast to your book, that central government does inevitably have a strong role to play in shaping some of those conditions. What levels of immigration can any community sustain before it is irreparably destabilized? How can local industry be insulated from the market forces that you were talking about? And then, as you acknowledge in the book, there are all kinds of global factors: climate change, the increasing threat of war, regulation of AI, which we're thinking about at the moment, all areas where central government needs to step up, not back. Towards the end of the book, you quote Nye Bevan, supporting your focus on the local, in citing his words that bigness is the enemy of humanity. But of course it's a paradox, because Bevan also created the second biggest employer in the world, the National Health Service. I suspect that conditions for the flourishing of the local does involve the state doing some big things. So that's my second question. What are these conditions we need to cultivate the flourishing of the local? And finally, your book is absolutely bursting with ideas, and it's deliberately quite resistant to programmatic agendas and one-size-fits-all solutions. And I was interested, as I was reading it, in some of the underlying guiding principles, which I think you've begun to set out for us this evening, of which I'm really grateful, because it just does seem to me that these easily thrown around political buzzwords like fairness and equality, they just don't get us far enough. My reading of your book suggests two guiding principles. In addition to those you've suggested this evening, I'll be keen to hear if you disagree or have others. The first would be dignity. You seem to be calling for the honouring of human dignity in the face of systems and institutions that dehumanise us, make decisions on our behalf, or alienate us with coldness and complexity. And you quote a priest from your time at the Children's Society asking, what do we stand for if not dignity? And that's a theme that's very present in, for example, Catholic social teaching over the last century, asserting the sacredness of the human and that it is something that sacredness is attacked when we are denied decent housing, decent employment, and ability to contribute to our communities and exercise basic freedoms. And the second would be the theme of association, which is, I think, what you were touching on in your speech this evening about recognising the individual within a sort of thick understanding of society. Not just the right of association, but a promotion of it as the principal means through which agency is exercised in the nation state. We're not a monolithic state in which each individual simply answers directly to the government. We are, as King Charles said to faith leaders just before his mother's funeral, a community of communities. And there he was quoting Father John Neville Figgis, a monk from the Community of the Resurrection in Mirfield at the turn of the 20th century, who was a major exponent of early English pluralism. And I think your book sits within this tradition of a society made up of multiple associations within which we find our agency and within which we live out what you describe in a phrase I rather like, our quiet patriotism. So that's the third point. What are our guiding principles, which I think is the direction you've taken the conversation this evening? I'd love to hear any responses you have to those questions and, of course, from the rest of our audience.
Great. Thank you so much both for that. We will now move to a time of Q&A in the room, and those of you online can submit your questions too. I will remind you that we would like to keep questions to sentences rather than paragraphs, and preferably they should end with a question mark. So I'll leave that one with you. But while you're thinking about what your questions might be, I think it's only fair if I give you, Lisa, maybe the chance to respond to the response. There were some brilliant questions already raised there that I think you might want to have a chance to answer.
Well, thanks very much. I did feel a little bit like I was at school having my homework marked while that was going on. And school did not go particularly well for me, so pleased to say that tonight has been a much more pleasant experience. I think it's a fair point about the role of religion, and I thought it was really interesting what you said about not wanting to be sort of idolised or, patronised, but recognised. And actually, you mentioned the time that I spent at the Children's Society, but I also see that very much at work in my own constituency, because Wigan has a very large Catholic population, and many other people who are Church of England. And more recently, we've welcomed people from other faiths as well. Particularly, we've got a small but growing Muslim community who came together after the Manchester bomb across faith communities and provided a level of, I suppose, what you would call sort of social glue that couldn't have been found from anywhere else. And whenever I walk into a local food bank or a credit union or a local library, the people who are volunteering tend to come from one of two places, either the Catholic community or from the Labour Party. They're not doing it under the umbrella of being part of the church or part of the Labour Party, but there is something in those institutions that compels people to come together and to work together for the common good. So I think that is absolutely right. I think one of the reasons why I talk less about other ways that people come together and that build the ties that bind is because I think the Labour Party has been spectacularly bad at recognising the power of place, that the place that you call home matters deeply to people. It's part of your identity, and that actually that quiet patriotism that I talk about in the book is often propelled by people's loyalty to their place and their desire to make it better. Secondly, I think it's a fair challenge about the role of national government, but I do explicitly make the point in the book that this is not an argument that local is good and national is bad. In fact, I start the book with the story of the collapse of my local football club, Wigan Athletic. And if the story of what happened to Wigan Athletic tells you anything, it tells you that the global and national systems that were set up to protect us matter. And when they fail, the local consequences are appalling. But my thesis is that central government is far too busy at the moment trying to do other people's jobs, trying to micromanage millions of decisions that should rightly be taken by people closer to home, and far too little interested in doing its actual job, which is precisely what you say, to create the conditions in which we can thrive. When I sit with a cafe owner in Halifax dealing with the appalling impact of frequent flooding, while politicians nationally are unable to get their act together to work with like-minded governments to go further and faster on tackling climate change, when I see the too frequent experience of people who've lost their football clubs, or older people defrauded by criminal gangs that roam across the world because we just can't get our act together to work either nationally or globally in order to create the right conditions for those people, it appalls me. I think we've lost our way, but I absolutely agree with you that the idea that local is good and national has somehow outlived its usefulness is just a device by politicians who cannot see how to reform the centre in order that the other parts will work. And in defence of Nye Bevan and his bigness is the enemy of humanity, he strongly believed that the National Health Service had to be a locally led service. It's one of the reasons why the National Health Service is quite fragmented, and he believed very strongly in a central role for volunteers in the running of the National Health Service, because he thought otherwise it wouldn't belong to the people. And actually in the Labour Party, as we've become incredibly focused on what the state can do to help, I think we've often forgotten that there is a place where people are quietly living out lives. It exists somewhere between states and markets, and it's called society. And the recognition of that by David Cameron, I think, was a wake-up call for us when he started talking about the big society, because it's something that I think we'd forgotten at our peril. And finally, what are the guiding principles on which you can build this sort of approach? I mean, I think that's kind of the point that I wanted to get into a little bit deeper in the lecture today. And I'd really, we're talking on the way in here, but I'd really, really welcome a discussion. I know you've all just been instructed to ask questions, but I think this is a debate that we need to have and a discussion that we need to have if we're going to find our way out of our current crisis and rebuild our relationship with the British people. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Brilliant, thank you. On that, we will hand over for preferably questions, although on that note, comments will be permitted. Although I am mindful we have kind of 20 more minutes of your time. So in this first kind of part of the Q&A, maybe we'll take any questions you have for Lisa, although obviously feel free to ask them more broadly. I think we've got a roaming mic somewhere over there, if Sue, do you want to? We'll start with one here. Are there any other, and one at the back, and then one here, and then we'll take another round in a bit.
I'm sure some of the other people will ask a lot deeper questions about your general lectures, but you mentioned football clubs and Wigan Athletic a lot. I just want to see what was your reaction to the recent points deduction, and are you just worried that there's going to be another slide, you have to be back out campaigning again?
All right, thanks for coming, Lisa. You talked about the state of the country we're in, and you talked about people who feel left behind and unheard. You're absolutely right. You're not just right, you're bang on. And I just wonder what your thoughts are about how important the concept of hope is in addressing that, and what role that plays for political leaders as they move this country forward.
And then just one here.
Hi there. Also in the book you talked a lot about the national v local debate, and I think that one of the things we learned 3 years ago was people are really sick of bickering, and especially party political bickering over issues that really are what people are passionate about. So with that in mind, why do you think it's Keir Starmer's taken the decision to consider making the House of Lords reformed when all we're going to get is substantially more bickering and less action?
Absolutely bonkers round of questions. I'm going to do my best to draw out a common thread. On the question about Wigan Athletic, obviously, I didn't want to see us get a points deduction, but I think the EFL actually, in my experience, over the time that we worked together to save the club, and now that we've run into some difficulties again, has actually been supportive and helpful within the constraints of what they can actually do. And what is needed is proper reform of the system so that the finances are spread much more equally across football, that we take this inverted pyramid and squash it so that we have opportunity across every part of the country, and national legislation that everybody in politics agrees on to ensure that our football clubs that matter deeply to us, you know, the chair of my supporters club, she has a season ticket. She used to go as a child with her dad. She sits in his seat. She takes her kids. This is part of our civic inheritance. And never again should we allow something that important to be used as a plaything for the rich and the wealthy, you know, people who come in, use the things that matter so much to us as toys and then discard them and throw them away when they're no longer of use. Social value matters, and that's really why I started with the story about Wigan Athletic, and I'm determined that we're going to get that change so that this doesn't happen to anybody else. And on this question of hope, you know, the thing that surprised me so much is how much hope there is out there. Even when everything feels completely broken, that people are still optimistic and ambitious for themselves, for their families, for their community, and for their country. But what's been missing for such a long time is a national government that can match that level of ambition. And I'm determined that we will, because I think these big waves of political upheaval that we've seen in recent years, my town's been at the epicentre of them. You know, whether it was the sudden, very dramatic fall in turnout in the run-up to 2010, or the very sudden and dramatic rise in support for UKIP in towns like mine, where we've driven the far right out of town over and over again for 100 years, or whether it was a vote to leave the European Union. All of these things, I think, and rising nationalism, not just in Scotland, but in England and Wales as well. I think these have been driven actually not by anger in the end, but by a belief that the future should and could be better than the one that is presently on offer to us. A few years ago during the leadership contest, I sat down in Toynbee Hall actually with Danny Boyle, because I wanted to understand, wanted to hear from him how it could possibly be that that great expression of a country that he gave voice to in the 2012 Olympics opening ceremony had just suddenly collapsed into rows about Scottish independence and Brexit and anger and division. And he said to me, that country's still there. It's just waiting for someone to give voice to it. And that's part of the reason that I wrote the book, and it's why I'm still in politics now. And finally, on this question of party politics and bickering, I think when you approach constitutional reform, you have to approach it on the basis of where the consensus is and build from there. And I think that will be the approach that Angela will take as we approach constitutional reform in government. But I don't think you can look at our political system and think that it's working. I make the point in the book that there aren't even spaces in Parliament, physical spaces for people to come together and negotiate our way through shared challenges. And the future will be negotiated. It won't be imposed. The change that lasts is the change, and the change that sticks is the one that you can build a consensus around, where we all have a shared stake in the outcome and skin in the game. And it's one of the reasons why when I was appointed to the job, the first thing that I said to Michael Gove was, I want you to succeed, because levelling up this country, rebuilding our local economies and our town centres, giving young people choices and chances in parts of Britain where for too long the only choice that's been available to them is if they want to get on, they've got to get out. That is a big job that will outlast and has to outlast successive electoral cycles. And that means there has to be a consensus about that. And I make no apology for saying that politics, party politics, should be subsumed to bigger questions about what is the ethical, the right thing to do.
Brilliant, thank you. Jim, have you got any thoughts on Wigan Athletics point deduction you want to share with us? Or perhaps maybe on hope and where we might find it?
It won't surprise anyone who knows me that I have no views on football whatsoever. But the hope question is interesting, and I think there is there's a temptation to think that hope is about having some big overarching vision that we can all feel like we're pulling towards, and that's partly the role of government, to kind of tell a story that people feel that they can buy into. But actually, I think hope is manifest in through being part of a community where you feel like your daily actions are meaningful and are contributing towards a better society and a better world. So going back to Lisa's food bank with the Catholics and the members of the Labour Party, you know, they're people who are within communities that have this kind of moral narrative, and this is why I think this associations business is very, very important. It'll be very difficult to bring hope, and I do worry about hope actually, particularly among the younger generation as we look at climate change and growing threat of war. I see a lot of despondency among young people, so I'm perhaps a bit more worried about hope than Lisa, but I think it's within these communities that we can cultivate hope.
Are there any more questions? Yeah, there's one on the front row here, one over there, and then one there. We'll have another round, so don't worry.
Hi, Lisa. Hi, my name's Susie from East London. Love the references to Toynbee Hall. So I work with Iranian refugees, and so this question may seem off topic, but it's fully on topic. I was really grateful to see the response of Labour Party leaders and church leaders around everything that's been going on in Iran over the last 6 months, which has been obviously appalling, but also disappointed in some of the lack of courage, boldness to speak out on certain things. But I'm not being critical of individuals. I'm just, and for me, I think that connects into a wider thing of like a lack of boldness and confidence that we see generally, which connects into, I think, stuff around social media and national media and how they conduct themselves. So my question is how does the leadership in the Labour Party and how does leadership in faith communities kind of refine that voice of boldness and courage and fresh vision to build a country that works? Because you look at people like Wilberforce, and he had people screaming in his face, "You're wrong," and he kept going. Do you know what I mean? And Clement Attlee the same, and Niall Bevan, who created the NHS, the same. And I'm just like, where are those voices now? How are we going to refine that? Because I look at people, and even politicians I've known for years in the Labour Party, and I worry for them because I can see a fear that has gripped them, which didn't grip Gary Lineker, and I don't want to give a whole speech. But my question is, the reason why this is fundamental is those great ideas that are going to break and change and transform, it needs to come from people that are going to not care and are going to go forward. But yeah, so there's something around maybe media regulation, but also something around how we raise and build our leaders and support our leaders so that they can be who they're needing to be. Who am I giving this mic to? Thank you. Question mark. And I shall just keep the mic. No, I'm joking.
Where am I going?
Thanks so much. I'm just wondering, I love the vision of a country characterised by dignity, obligation, reciprocity. How close is the Labour Party, do you think, to articulating that compared to perhaps the alternative of articulating a more liberal, individualistic view of the world and society? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how close are we?
My question is about how we bridge some of those divides in our community. Lisa, you talked about the false binary of caring for our people within our borders and outside of our borders. How do we debunk that myth, particularly when the polling suggests that the majority of the British public are in favour of putting refugees who arrive here on boats on a plane and sending them off to Rwanda. Like, what do we do about that, and how do we increase that sense of like global solidarity? And James, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, particularly considering the multicultural nature of LSE and how many international students you have. What you see as working, maybe a bit more about how you get those like interfaith communities to connect on that, and do you see any of that, particularly around this refugee issue, students that are from those countries or countries around those countries, do you see that causing tension, and how do you deal with that?
Amazing. Shall I? Yeah. Okay. So on the question about the whether the Labour Party is going to be able to articulate an alternative to sort of more liberal individualistic view, well spotted, because what I was essentially trying to argue is that there is a different tradition in the Labour Party, a lost tradition that the likes of Tawney, Beveridge and others were pursuing. And I think we've somewhat lost our way from that, and we need to find our way back. And so do I think that we're closer to articulating that? Yeah, I think we are, but I think that's because just as their times demanded it, so did ours. I was really struck when I was doing a bit of reading and thinking ahead of today that, you know, one of the things that was so, it was obvious that the Attlee government was going to have to nationalise large parts of our services and to build council housing, more council houses than any other government in history to this day. And there was a broad consensus around that, not because of ideology, but because it was the only answer to the condition of the time. So I think the times demand that from us again, and it requires us to reclaim a lost tradition in the party. And then I'll take the other two sort of together. The last time you and I were holding mics, Susie, I seem to remember, was when we were doing karaoke at party conference. Won't subject you to that again. I don't think anybody needs a repeat of that. But I think it's a fair question about refugees. But I would just say this, right? That I'm somebody who works with refugee and migrant children in the time before I came into Parliament, not just at the Children's Society, but also the reason I went to the Children's Society was because I was working with unaccompanied asylum-seeking children at Centrepoint. And it was at a time when Labour was in power and was doing fantastic things for children in care. And we were seeing a real plummeting of care leavers in our hostels and ending up on the streets. But at the same time, we were seeing a huge rise in asylum-seeking children. And the reason was because of the way that they were being treated. And so I'm not shy about standing up and speaking out against injustice and making the moral case for asylum. Nigel, who you mentioned, I quoted in the book, our priest at the Children's Society said to me, you know, first day he said Jesus was a refugee, and I said, well, that's good news, because it means that I'm going to be able to win the case for funding internally. But there's a strong moral case around this, and I think people are receptive to it. I think people are fundamentally decent. And it's the indecency of a lot of what the government is proposing that is going down very, very badly back home. They like to characterise the Red Wall as a place where we're all xenophobic and racist and bigoted. But my constituents are working class men and women who are fundamentally decent and don't like indecency. And so I think they're barking up the wrong tree. But I would just say as well that when we talk about the fact that they literally can't organise, excuse my language, a piss up in a brewery, that they've lost control of the asylum system, that they have no ability to process applications, that's a moral case as well. It's a moral case because people are left for years without the ability to put down roots and plan and start a family and move forward with their lives. But it's also a moral case because this is a hoax that they're perpetrating against the British people, that they reach for immigration and asylum every time they're in trouble. They tell you that the problems are all created by it, and then they tell you they're fixing it, and they're doing nothing of the sort, and we're not prepared to stand by and let them get away with it. And this question about the false binary, but people feeling that, you know, that there is too much immigration in Britain and the support for plans like Rwanda. Well, look, I would just say that I think borders are very powerful symbols of security.
And at a time when people feel that the whole world is spinning out of control, that their basic security in their own lives and their children's lives is being eroded, when your high street's falling apart, you can't go into the town centre at 11 o'clock in the morning without feeling sad and scared, and when you don't have enough money at the end of the week to heat your home and put food on the table for your children, I think that's when things get really difficult in this debate. And one of the things that I've learned from my time as Wigan's MP is that when Serco put asylum seekers into a hotel overnight without any warning in a small pit village on the outskirts of my constituency, in a place that is 98.5% white British, they put 150 young men from various parts of Africa overnight. And the far right mobilised and people travelled in to demonstrate. The way that we turned that around was to give people a choice. We called a public meeting. We said we take more asylum seekers and provide more asylum accommodation than any other part of Greater Manchester. And we can negotiate to ensure that other places take them instead. And the council will do that if that's what you decide. And when we gave people a choice, they said absolutely not. They set up a five-a-side team for the asylum seekers to play in. They organised a collection across Wigan, and we got 36,000 bags of donations of goods in 2 weeks. That tells me that people are fundamentally good. They're just waiting for politicians who can match that.
Great, thanks. Any thoughts, Jim?
So just on the international solidarity, I mean, I think there's an enormous amount of international solidarity at LSE. The challenge is for it not to be one of the cosmopolitan elite, essentially. But it is, I would say, within the faith communities where a sort of an international solidarity of justice is, really being pursued. We did a bit of work a few years ago in support of refugees from Syria, and there was a very strong, particularly across the Abrahamic faiths, cooperation going on, partly because a lot of the refugees, well, most of the refugees were Muslim, most of the groups receiving them were Christian, and a lot of support and resource was coming from the Jewish community because they know what it's like to be refugees. And so it's an issue around which I think a lot of constructive interfaith work can be done. On the point about sort of faith leaders speaking out, and somebody else mentioned earlier House of Lords, and it's often said we shouldn't have bishops in the Lords because it sort of it stifles them kind of being prophetic and speaking out and so forth. I don't think that's how the government are currently thinking about the bishops, and I've been quite, I've been pleased at the voice they've particularly given to what's going on for refugees. With situations like Iran, and I'm sure you know this, but part of the challenge of faith communities is that they are global networks. And so sometimes there is a reticence to speak out because grandstanding in one part of the world might not be in the interests of a minority in another part of the world. And I, as I've kind of risen a little bit in the ranks of the Church of England, I've been pleased to see more of that kind of going on that it's just hard to talk about.
Conscious of the time, but I think we have time for, great. We've got a question over there, and one here, and then one there. But I'm also going to take chair's prerogative, and when you've kind of answered those, I'd like to kind of ask what's the one thing you'd like us to take away from tonight, because I think this probably will be your last thing to share with us. When you've answered those, what one thing would you like us to take away, to do or to think about differently as a result of being here tonight? So we're going there.
Thank you. Thank you. Lisa, you said you referred to the financial crash and said that since then we've had a model that doesn't command popular support, and we've had numerous examples since then of, well, the later recent oil companies and their profits. We have a business system which is basically there for private benefit, for private gain. Do you think that the left, and Labour Party, but the left should be more broadly embracing and more actively embracing mutual and cooperative enterprise, which I would argue, and others in the cooperative sector, is enterprise for the common good, because it's kind of not done so very forcefully so far. And I just wonder what your thoughts on that are.
you. Thinking about the conditions that central government need to set for flourishing in local communities, what do you think are the conditions that need to be set in order for every community to have enough good quality housing?
My wife, Canon Ann Easter, is the Mayor's Commissioner for Interfaith Dialogue in the London Borough of Newham. And over the last 2 years, she's built up a thriving and lively group. How could that be spread out across the country? And your comment about leadership, and I'm afraid that the Christian communities are not going to be good at developing leadership, because the vicar is right. And the last thing he wants to do is develop leadership in his congregation. That's not true of all of us. And the same goes for the Labour Party. I'm afraid my local Labour Party is very hierarchic. And so where do you think leadership will be developed and grown? I have the privilege of being chaplain to West Ham Sea Cadets, and watching Sea Cadets grow in and develop in maturity and confidence, so that when they get a little bit older, they're ready for leadership. It's quite extraordinary, but I don't see it in many other places.
Lisa, I'll let you take whatever kind of combination of those questions in any order.
Crikey, right, okay. So in relation to the question about mutuals and cooperatives, there's a strong sort of strand of that throughout the whole book. I think we missed a real opportunity with Northern Rock when it collapsed to remutualise, and the consequences for people in the northeast particularly have been severe. These institutions that we build and own in common can weather storms, they can help us weather storms that others not necessarily can. And I think you're right about that. I was very struck. I was working with children when we were last in government, and I was very struck by how quickly the Tory government were able to unravel the Sure Starts that were designed, funded and executed from Whitehall, but how difficult it was for them to dismantle the energy cooperatives that had grown up in every part of the country that were co-owned and run by hundreds of local people. And it's why part of the argument in the book is about tilting power back to people who've got a stake in the outcome and skin in the game, because those people, as I learned particularly from mums who've been through my constituency surgery over the last 13 years, who've got children with special needs, those women, without any exception, regardless of their levels of income, background, educational qualification or confidence, have mastered and beaten the opaque systems that surround their children's care, because they can do no other. They work harder, they try longer, they think more creatively, and they're in it for the long haul. But I do think that there's a much, and I'm not just saying this because Johnny's here, but there's a much bigger pool of people out there who don't work in mutuals or the cooperative sector, who work in private enterprises, who understand and believe passionately that individuals exist in society. And just to give one example that comes to your question about housing, the pension funds are currently doing some really exciting work with Labour councils in many parts of the country, rebuilding our social housing stock, because they need a return on their investment, but they only need, what they really want is a steady return over a long period of time. They're not there to make a quick buck and to extract from the system. And so as many buy-to-let landlords are getting out of the market since Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng and the disaster that was, they're bringing those back into social use in partnership with Labour councils like the council in Barking and Dagenham, which is a really positive development. If you want to get good quality housing into every part of the country, though, you've got to do two things. The first thing is you've got to level up. You've got to get economies working in parts of the country where we've ignored for far too long, because at the moment what we're doing is trying to power a major economy in a modern country using only a handful of people in a handful of sectors in a few parts of the country. And that's a disaster for our housing crisis, because, you know, I was one of those young people a few years ago, 20 years ago, I moved from Lancashire to London looking for better opportunities and wages. I found them, but I also found the cripplingly high housing costs that are scarring an entire generation. So you've got to provide choices and chances in other parts of the country too, because if you undercook some parts of our country, you overheat others. And secondly, you've got to build some houses. And we're unashamedly advocating for building houses. I don't care what this government is doing, because there aren't enough houses to meet housing need, and it's just unconscionable. The way to get that done, I think, is that you involve communities about the sort of housing that is being built. In my constituency, we've had the big, blow-ups over new developments, as every member of parliament has, and those of you who are councillors will have still have scars on your back from them. But my honest belief is that people will support new housing. What they won't support is £500,000 houses in towns where average household earnings are £21,000 a year, and their kids are having to either live in really poor quality private rented or move away in order to get housed. And then finally, I think this is the biggest question of all, actually, about leadership and how you show leadership in very hierarchical institutions. And I couldn't possibly comment on the Labour Party and whether it's a top-down managerialist institution. But I do recognise a lot of what you say is true. But I would say this, what I'm arguing for in the book and tonight is a different way of doing politics, a much more democratic way of decision-making that requires everybody to step up and play their part. Because if you think about the challenges that we've got an economic crisis. The next Labour government will inherit the worst economic situation probably since the Second World War. And you can't reboot our economy and create the highest sustained growth in the G7 if all you want to do is focus on a few sectors in a few parts of the country. It's going to require everybody to step up to do their bit. We can't solve the climate change crisis without the participation of people in every part of our country. We can't solve the crisis of loneliness that we've got that comes with an ageing population from the centre. The challenges of Tawney's age demanded big, top-down, national responses. And, not to reopen the debate about national versus local, because everybody has to play their part. But the point is that the challenges that we face are ones that cannot be solved from the centre alone. And so we're going to have to find new ways of enabling and encouraging and supporting people to show leadership in their everyday lives and communities. And if people could take one thing away, I guess it's this. What I'm arguing really is quite big. That people have called time on an economic model that has outlived its usefulness, and we need to rethink the way that we power our economy from every part of Britain, drawing on the assets and the potential that exists there. That requires a fundamental rewiring of our systems of governance at both national, global and local level. And in order to do it, we need a different sort of politics, and based more on negotiation, democracy and consent, so a new political culture. And we need an ethical basis to the decisions that we make that will act as a North Star to take us forward into the country and the world that we want to create. So is that something that I can do, or that Johnny can do, or that Keir can do alone? It absolutely isn't. Building that new consensus, building that new settlement, building something that will take this country forward after a very, very dark, divisive decade, possibly the darkest, most divisive decade in my lifetime, doesn't just fall to me or to Johnny, it falls to every single one of us.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Lisa, for that. We're now, as I said at the start, going to welcome Johnny to come off the subs bench and come and fill in. Johnny, I won't come straight to you because we've a chance to settle in, but we have heard a lot about different business models and different kind of ways in which. So I wonder if while Jim gives us some reflections on some of the questions that we've just had, You might be thinking about where, as Shadow Business Secretary, what your kind of thoughts on this might be, that we'll come to you in a minute for that.
So yeah, where are young leaders being formed? The LSE Faith Centre, check us out. But seriously, part of the reason why I went into university ministry is because doing this kind of work with young people in the church is now difficult because the young people aren't there and the capacity is very, very thin. And I see a lot of church leadership also feeling very, very anxious, almost paralyzed with anxiety about safeguarding and all the regulation that there is around working with young people. And we have to move beyond that. We, at some point, if the church is going to renew itself, we have to regain that confidence. But in the meantime, reaching out to Sea Cadets and work in universities and so forth, I think is super important. And I think you also made a point about interfaith work within within localities. I'm so encouraged by the interfaith work that I see going on across the UK. I think we may have, certainly within Europe, one of the strongest community-based interfaith networks through things like sacres, which take responsibility for education and school assemblies, but multiple kinds of community forums, some convened by local authorities, some based within the faith communities themselves, which always tends to be better. And that gives this country a kind of resilience, particularly in the face of interreligious conflict, which is really affecting other parts of Europe and is fueling populism, that is perhaps a source of hope.
Great, thank you. We will take another round of questions in a minute. But Johnny, where is business in this, or where is the vision for business in this?
Well, good evening, everyone. I should explain at the start here. One of us had to vote in the division tonight, so it was me or Lisa. So I laid down myself at the start of Tawney this year so I could cast a vote and have Lisa here, which I think, by the looks of it, has worked quite well. I always as well have a slight feeling where I think, because we tend to invite people I know personally, clearly, from the Shadow Cabinet to do this for us. I think, I wonder what the questions are going to be like when we start. I hope they're going to be all right. And I thought you fantastic, and no one can say that wasn't an eclectic spread of questions that we gave Lisa there at the beginning. Let me just come to a colleague's question over here about business, obviously, which is my front bench responsibility and its role in this. I mean, I thought Lisa laid out how we think about this very well in the sense of, I myself am a cooperative MP. Our policy on mutualism is a crucial part of our pledges. We believe we can double the size of the mutual sector in the UK, and that's with reference to the number of mutuals we have and their relative share of the economy when we compare ourselves to a France or a Germany. We think that's a realistic pledge. What we are very careful not to do is come across like we don't speak the language that is relevant to everybody in this country. And we certainly, in my brief, don't want to come across like we're saying, of course we like business, just not the kind of business you work in. It's got to be something for everyone. And I think we've got to be very much aware, there's not, in terms of how British companies work, a set of people called the shareholders in a room like this. It's in the main our pension funds, and I think actually that is a very important concept that we need to understand. But I do think mutuals play a crucial role, and we can expand that very much. And I believe that actually there's a wider conversation there about, what is the kind of, an area I find of huge interest, not always for everyone, but how we operate corporate governance in this country, incentivize that long-term prosperity, that sense of fairness that comes from, who are companies there for? How do they operate? How do we respect all the stakeholders within there? Do we think our current system does that? And it's you have to take people with you in that argument. You have to make sure what you're developing is serious and effective, because sometimes ideas, I think, are pitched in this space which look a little bit superficial and aren't getting to the core, I think, of what that question was about. But look, when over 80% of people in this country work in the private sector, that has got to be integral. If you want a country that works, right, you've got to have policies and companies in that space that are delivering that. And I do think one thing that's of huge interest to everyone in this room should be, there is a very different kind of ethos and set of driving values amongst the current crop of business leaders in this country today, even say compared to the late 90s when Labour was last making this transition from opposition into power. And I think we have a lot of natural allies in that space. I think there are people, there's a fantastic set of movements around purpose in business, around B Corps, about how people essentially are going into business for social purpose and want a partner in government who understands that, can be there with them. And look, I find that very exciting, but I think, to answer the question directly, Hannah, it is integral to how we build a country that works.
Brilliant, thank you. Do we have any more questions either in the room or Sue, do we have any that have come in on email? Do you want to?
I can find out.
Yeah, we've got one here to take us off.
Let me just go find out. There you go, Jenny.
Thank you. I have a question for you, Johnny. I know that you're not DWP anymore, your business, but this might still be relevant. Considering, you know, the way that the Bible talks about, we have, you know, we take joy and dignity in work, but it's not the whole purpose of our being, and we should be able to have fulfilled lives outside of work. Has there been consideration of, like serious consideration of a 4-day week policy, and is there going to be discussion with stakeholders basically ahead of the manifesto?
Do you want to answer that? And then I wonder, Jim, if you might have some thoughts on that, because I know you picked up on the importance of dignity as one of the things as well, and so maybe you can give us a slightly more philosophical question. But Johnny, I will ask you what's going in the manifesto too.
Well, look, I mean, Jenny, I think we would all agree, first of all, that all work should be good work, and I think traditionally people have done the job that I aspire to do as business secretary of, you know, if you think about what do you think of as the classic photo op for a business secretary, it's usually a hard hat and high vis and aerospace or automotive being made, you know, and actually, you know, part of our industrial strategy that I am very proud of talks about the everyday economy, talks about how, you know, care in an aging society has to be a fundamental pillar of an industrial strategy, and also that everyone should have dignity in work, and obviously that's our New Deal for working people, and I often think actually one of the misunderstood things is that's obviously about social justice in terms of tackling insecurity in the workplace. It's also an economic policy as well. You know, I think that is often kind of not really appreciated. On the 4-day week, look, it's a really interesting, you know, set of things that have happened, particularly in terms of the trials. It's important to say there is nothing stopping any company doing a 4-day week. You know, logically, you would have to make sure that your productivity over 4 days rises to the point that it pays the same level of wages. Otherwise, you're just cutting everyone's wages by a fifth. And you know, we should always approach this from the point of view that at one point people thought the idea of weekends were basically impossible, or even, you know, removing children from the labour force would be impossible. So we shouldn't sort of think that the current way in which work operates is somehow, you know, always how it will be, because it has evolved over time, and we've seen even in the pandemic a very you know, significant, I think, change in people's attitudes to place and work, and how, you know, how you can do work and be based in different parts of the country because of that flexibility that people accept. I think that the hardest part of the 4-day week argument is conceptualizing how public services would work in that time. I mean, let's be honest, you know, if you went and said right now that the NHS was only going to run 4 days a week, I think we would wonder, given the outcomes and the waiting lists we've got on the current arrangements, that is very difficult. So that bit is extremely difficult. Companies themselves looking at how they can offer work in different ways, how they can work with us on our New Deal for working people to make sure that there's the kind of flexibility people expect. That is very much in our thinking. But I don't think this is ever going to be about the government declaring that it's a 4-day week in the private sector, and somehow everyone has to make their outcomes work on that basis. Where companies are doing it themselves, you know, absolute fair play to them that they are being willing to innovate and take that forward. But I find, you know, the argument about how schools or hospitals would work on that basis, you know, we shouldn't shy away from the fact that is clearly a very difficult question.
Great, thanks, Jim.
I've got some of my team members here, so if I advocate a 4-day week, I think they're just going to laugh. Laugh at me. But I'm interested in these questions of meaningful work, and as a centre we did do some thinking about it a few years ago, and to have my late colleague in the anthropology department, Professor David Graeber, wrote a book which I probably shouldn't quote at a Christian event, called Bullshit Jobs. And his argument was just how much labour is just not meaningful for people. And I'm less interested in reducing people's hours, I think, than thinking about an industrial strategy that actually makes people feel that they're doing creative and meaningful things. And that seems to me to go hand in hand with what we've got to think about more now, which is being less reliant industrially on regimes that we now are more anxious about working with, and renewing manufacturing in this country. And I think that's quite a big task for a next Labour government, actually.
We should add that David Graeber's argument that labour isn't meaningful is about labour in the sense of work, not in sense of the party. I'm sure he's got different views on that. Do we have any more questions? I think we've got time for at least a couple more. There's one at the back there. and one over here.
Thank you so much. A question for John, actually. In the wake of the bank failures, so SBV being taken over by HSBC, Credit Suisse being merged with UBS, and the point you made earlier about good business and bad business, how do we change this narrative that we have as a country that bankers are the enemy, essentially, that the City of London is not the place to be? How do we change the narrative to communicate that actually financial services ecosystem contributes so much to our economy, to our global competitiveness? And what is Labour's plan to invigorate our financial services ecosystem as well?
Thanks. Hello, Johnny. I know that everybody here understands why the voluntary sector matters. And I think people know that it's not just the particular tasks that are fulfilled, it's the listening to communities, the being flexible, the being alert to new and emerging problems, and the campaigning. So if we're to respect and build this, we need a proper policy for the voluntary sector. So my question is, please could you take back to whoever is responsible the need to set out a financing regime which will give voluntary sector organisations a bit more stability, and maybe could we also think about having some national forums to bring them together and institutionalise the listening and campaigning bit?
I've got a kind of two-pronged question. Someone mentioned a little bit AI earlier, and what you were just talking about, the kind of the dignity of work and things. And so on kind of the increasing advancement of AI and robotics, is there any discussion happening around how that affects the dignity of work and kind of continual replacement of human thought and creativity with artificial thought and creativity, but also how does this kind of continue the advancement of inequality, because with robotics and AI, it's this kind of continued pathway to whoever owns the technology ends up being the where the money and the power gets concentrated, rather than necessarily what some of the dialogue is, which is, all this technology will bring, will bring help to everyone. Driverless cars will enable this and that, different people to get around, but actually it's still concentrating power.
Well, another great set of questions. I'll start that one at the back about good and bad sectors and good and bad firms, and particularly around the city. I mean, I think this is an area on the whole that too often in the political sphere people can get into overly simplistic narratives. It's a bit like, at times you'll hear in the House of Commons people say, I don't like big business, I like small business. Well, actually, some small businesses can be terrible places to work for people, can be exploitative. Some big business can be some of the best places to work in the country. It doesn't work that way. You think about, you also hear a kind of at times, that say manufacturing is good and services are bad. And again, I mean, as if the two things have nothing in common with each other, and it doesn't work. Specifically around the city, where a country has an incredibly significant, globally significant sector, it tends to get a bit of flack because it seemed to dominate the political system. So actually, if you go to Germany, the automotive sector, car manufacturing is such a significant part, as people know, of what Germany's economy does very well. It gets complaints in the same way people will complain about the city in the UK. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is, I often wonder, when people talk about the city, how many people really know what we're talking about? I mean, some people even say to me, what actually goes on in, that tower at Canary Wharf, and what goes on around the Bank of England? And I think, first of all, you make that clear. I mean, we're talking about the insurance sector, which I would argue, in fact, I once pitched at an ABI conference, is a socialist sector. I mean, the insurance industry protects people against risks to which they can't themselves protect themselves. I mean, I think that is a very different sector to investment banking, very different sector to asset management. I would say on the whole, and I've said this many times, I was the Shadow City Minister for a while, I don't think anyone in that sector does themselves any favours if they sort of say, look, the city pays so much tax, it's equivalent to half the cost of the NHS. Because it sounds like what you're saying there is, we don't do very good things, but we pay a load of tax. Now, actually, if you say we provide the finance where people can own their own homes or protect themselves against the risks that they and their family need protecting against, or manage people's assets so that their pensions can give them dignity in retirement, that is how I would argue for that sector. And I think it goes back to purpose and why excuse me, why that is so significant and why people are doing that. Helen, a great question about the voluntary sector. I will take that back as you have requested. I think there's a wider point you make there about, and Lisa's book and what you were saying earlier reflects this, which is the sheer amount of capacity that has been taken out of so many important spheres in public life, the voluntary sector, local authorities. And we've clearly seen, again, referenced in the earlier conversation, the people at times, and food banks probably the clearest example of this, having to fill in those gaps where there's been that retreat. But I look back to that conversation around kind of the big society and David Cameron and the Osborne pitch, and I don't think really that has been fulfilled, because I think the sort of naive assumption you withdraw the state and that is filled. You need the framework, as you're saying, to fill in there and do it. And Daniel, I mean, your question on AI, I mean, if we look at the big things that are going to shape, the century that's coming our way, I think in the long term AI will probably be the greatest thing of all that will do that. But I don't think necessarily that's something we should fear. I think the consequences could be so far reaching, it's hard to even quantify. But we shouldn't think that requires, the absence of human input. I mean, if you look at the difficult policy issues in there, I mean, it requires, in some sense, I would say, it's, there's a set of moral values you've got to program into AI, and there are some incredibly difficult ethical questions around driverless and autonomous vehicles and how should they react to certain situations. And actually, in a way, I would argue in some ways, Daniel, there's a bigger need for human input, ethical, theological, at times, input into those questions before you can even understand what the ramifications would be. And I think that it's a genuinely fascinating and not easy area to look at.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I think that AI doesn't just raise questions about the dignity of work. I think it raises questions about the dignity of humanity itself, and profound questions about what we want human beings to do and what we want non-humans to do. I was in a seminar recently where a colleague was arguing that this was the answer to the care sector, that artificial intelligence would be able to care for our elderly people. That's not how I want to end my life, I think. And these sorts of questions we're going to have to engage with, and the church has actually got to step up and think about, what does it mean to be human? What do we want to protect? And then government has to respond. And in relation to work, I think we may just be on the verge of AI taking a large number of people's jobs away, and we've got to decide if we want it to do that. Because we have to remember that technology is a tool at the service of humanity and not vice versa. And I think that might be something that believers need to reassert.
And I'm going to end by asking you both the same question I asked Lisa to end with, which is, what one thing would you like us all to take away from this evening, from this conversation, if we are all going to build a country that works? And I'm including all of us in that we, not just those who are elected or in any position of leadership. What one thing can we take away, to think about, to do, to maybe put into practice as a result of this? Johnny, I'll ask you first, and then Jimmy, you can have the last word on that.
Such a big question. I was hoping I would go second, to be honest, Hannah. But I think going back to an earlier question that was put to the panel, it would be hope, because I think the challenges are immense. I think that is absolutely, without question, I think this country faces a set of challenges, whether it's our economic performance, the future after Brexit, net zero, the relative position of the UK, all of which in their own right would be significant challenges, and together they're a fundamental set of challenges. But I never want people to go away from that feeling, that there shouldn't be hope for the future, because actually I think we should be incredibly optimistic. There are huge opportunities, and too much of British politics at times, I think, is nostalgic for a golden era that never really existed. And I think that the job we all have should be to be people who are frank and face up to those challenges, but do so in a way which is about fixing them. And that to me is the basis of hope and optimism. So that is what I would want to see people take away more than anything else.
I love this theme that Lisa's written about in her book that's come out this evening of a community of communities. And I think the happiest people I see are people who have their families, have their work, but are part of these wider associations that give them meaning and energy. And I suspect everyone here is actually knows what that is, because it is the Labour Party, it is faith communities. And so I really hope that amongst all the other things we need them to do, the next Labour government really think about that flourishing of a society that looks like that, where we're living out purpose within communities and where we have strong dialogue and friendship across those communities.
A great place to end it for tonight. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. Thank you, Jim, for all of your contributions. Thank you as well to Lisa and the team. And thank you, Johnny, for taking one for the team and going and voting so that we could have Lisa for the best part of the evening. Not that you were not the best part of the evening, obviously. I'll buy you a drink for that one in a minute. But that is it for tonight's conversation. But we are keen that this is not the end of the conversation. So please do stick around, carry on thinking about these issues, certainly carrying on the debate and much of the stuff that we have been talking about tonight. If you are not a member, it would be remiss of me not to suggest that you might also like to join Christians on the Left. You can do that from the postcards outside, but do stick around, carrying on the conversation, and not just tonight. But thank you all for being here, and thank you to those of you who've been watching online as well. We will leave it there. Thank you so much.